I'm going to cover off a little bit on myself and BreakFree to start. We'll talk about the agenda. BreakFree was started about 7 years ago with the idea of being the top execution partner for financial institutions and banks on digital execution. Most of these banks and financial institutions had digital strategies, and there really isn't anybody out there who wanted to kind of roll up their sleeves, if you will, using the old cliche, and help execute on these strategies alongside their teams and their organization and help do the hard work to make it actually happen. We had to figure out, 6 or 7 years ago, how do you solve security and compliance for digital? That really wasn't a solved thing. And we were wildly successful. They built a bunch of cool apps in the cloud, something that banks weren't doing and we're not talking about. And we've taken that experience and continued to enhance it. And it's turned into our digital security framework, which is what we're going to primarily whiteboard today, how that works, how we institute it. We'll talk about the phased approach to using it and what we see most companies going through in terms of being able to support digital. And that's where we're solving for how do you do security and compliance in those realms when you've got a lot of churn, a lot of change, a lot of new dynamics. In terms of the agenda today, we'll first do a little bit of baselining to talk about what are kind of the outside factors and functions that are really leading us to need to solve this stuff and why it's an absolutely critical thing to solve and why it's not something that's already been solved with past solutions. And then we'll jump into, as I kind of alluded to, we see it as two distinct phases most security groups take when trying to solve for digital security. We'll talk about tactically how we see the most successful journeys go and how we think that that's a solid approach and most organizations should probably follow that. All right, so I wanted to start with, like I said, a baseline of where we're seeing most technology organizations, and why that's important is we tend to see the security organization is really focused on engaging the technology organization in this kind of digital transformation. I know that's like a big buzzword, but it is causing us to rethink a bunch of ways that we work in the technology organization. And what we see most of the time is the security organization is having to go along for the ride, if you will, and a lot of times it's being led by the technology organizations. And then we'll pivot specifically to, okay, if this is where most technology organizations are going, here's how we think the security organization can respond to that. All right, so what we're seeing in most technology organizations is that they have, when we use pillars to represent this, they have done a really good job at building an IT services capability, or like I said, when we talk about a lot of times, we're like a pillar, a capability pillar. So they've done a really good job at operationalizing an IT services based mechanism for meeting the demands that the business has put on the technology organization over the last 30 years. And the IT services world, and I'm not going to get into too much theory or anything like that. I promise to get through this quick. But they're going to be based on working in ITIL ITSM to really manage their consistent engagement with the business, their service delivery, how they manage what's going on in their IT services space. And they're going to have a PMO-based workflow for managing work that's not standard in terms of service delivery across the things that they actually manage in their IT services space. Most of what's going on these days, even today, is happening in the data center. And sometimes that data center is cloud-based, but it's still structured as a service. I still would consider that very data center-esque in terms of how they're operating it. And the way they view it is they have assets inside of this data center that they're using ITIL and PMO to manage and deliver and really drive the service requests the business is looking for. And they've organized their functional expertise into like very specialized resources around things like network. You might even have some security engineering in here. You might have some data center focused folks. You might have app focused folks. But these teams of resources are very specialized. They are, in the broad scheme of things, seen as relatively expensive And what we talk about a lot, and what's important, is that this specific IT services pillar is very focused on unit cost. The business ultimately sees the IT services around assets as the cost of them doing business, right? I can't run my finance department without software. I can't be an organization that's engaging and not have email. I can't not have computers, right? I can't not have identity. I have to do these things basically to function as a business. I need to balance how much that costs to do, because everything that costs more takes away from the revenue I'm generating on my business side. And so this group is very focused on unit costs. How much does it actually cost me to deliver a service, and how do I optimize the management of the assets to deliver that service in the most cost-effective way possible? That's why everything has to have, ROI associated with it. A very common term we use in this space. They want to see the cost savings, and I'm not saying that these concepts aren't important in the digital age, but I'll talk about why they're secondary, basically, to the first piece. But just know that this is a situation that security organizations find themselves looking at over the past 30 years as well. And what they've done a really good job at is looking at how services and data centers and resource structures, project management, et cetera, works. And they've really built interfaces. A lot of times, it's in process. In the data center, it's in tooling. In here, a lot of times it can be in training or potentially in actually resourcing. But they've found ways to basically ensure security and compliance by creating interfaces into these different areas. In the PMO, for example, a lot of times there's things like security review of projects, right? There's sign-offs, there's process steps they've integrated. In ITIL ITSM, there are similarly technology reviews, and there are service requests mechanisms that tie into identity and authorization, and they keep they integrate with things like change management and config management to ensure things are consistently controlled in a very specific way. And I talked about the resourcing. So they've done a really good job at basically identifying, hey, if security's job is to make sure that what we're doing across the organization is secure and compliant, one of the mechanisms they have to focus on is the technology organization. They've, like I said, done a really good job at integrating and meeting technology where they're at, and building specific ways of working with the idea that this is the primary mechanism for technology in organizations. Well, what's shifting is digital, right? And a lot of us know that. What's happening is the business is realizing that technology is now a force for profit, that it's no longer the cost of doing business alone. I actually need to have a mechanism that allows me to create new channels, new strategies, new capabilities for business that only can happen through technology. And so technology no longer becomes the cost of doing business, but fundamentally how I do business for certain work streams. And so what we help a lot of technology organizations understand is that this specific digital transformation, I put that in huge quotations, for the technology operating model is an expansion of their operating model to include a digital capability, right? So we kind of like to call it, pillars, right? And so what the technology organization doing is expanding into digital. And some of them refer to it as digital engineering. Sometimes it's called product development. It kind of just depends on, what big consulting firm they're talking to or who they've got leading the charge in terms of nomenclature. But I'm sure over time we'll settle on, one of these things. And inside this pillar, right, we've got a different makeup of frameworks and ways of working. It looks similar, and I'll draw it out in a second, to what's on the IT services side, but what's actually used to accomplish the same goals of, controlling engagement with the business, managing work and projects, managing the actual technology assets that are built in here. It's all different approaches to it. And the reason it's different is actually because the underlying equation or the driver underneath the pillar is different. So in this realm, we don't shy away from that. At the end of the day, it's about profit or business strategy, right? And in this realm, what I'm really focused on is speed, adaptability, constant change and variability. Variability is expected. Here, variability equals bad, right? And it's bad because it's going to cost us more. Most classic examples, like, I'm a data center guy by trade, but like, I remember when I was, in the engineering field, you went and worked for a company and it was like, hey, we're a Microsoft shop. Hey, we're a Linux shop, and they said this because fundamentally, if they were both a Microsoft and a Linux shop, they had to have basically double the cost to achieve many of the same outcomes. So that variability is very bad in terms of unit costs. And so they avoided that with a lot of different processes at their PMO layer and other things. In digital, we expect it to be variable. Even just, and because they're building on cloud, variability doesn't have as much constraint anymore from their perspective, because it's not like we have to figure out how to operationalize something. The cloud, basically figures that out, and I click the button or I write the script, and there I go, I have it. Now, we know it's not that simple, and from security's perspective, they know it's not that simple. But the point is that we're expecting variability here because I'm going to build a bunch of stuff to drive profit, and I can't worry so much out of the gate about making sure that it looks like everything else, because I'm more focused on time to market, getting that out. And so what the technology organization is doing here is, number one, they are building product, right? And they're bringing a product-like mentality to technology. Instead of using ITIL ITSM to manage technology, they're using DevOps. Instead of the PMO, they're going to be using Agile. And they're not going to be building things in the data center. They're going to be building on the cloud, which is super variable. I mean, there's thousands of ways of configuring and consuming the cloud, but that's to their benefit. And then in terms of how they're going to organize their people, they're going to organize it around cross-functional teams. They're going to have outcomes that they're focused on achieving, less on specific subject matter expertise that they're providing a capacity for. Why do I say all this for digital security? Well, just like our new realm, digital security basically has not figured out, or they need to figure out, these interfaces here. And what happens a lot for organizations in the get-go who don't quite understand this, you see them trying to just take what they did in the past, which is built on low variability, a lot of control, not to say that they're slow, but they're extremely risk adverse when it comes to variability and any kind of changes, et cetera, because that's what the system is built to do. Because if they allow a bunch of variability, that creates risk, which could create more cost, which wasn't necessary because we already had a solution that did the thing that we wanted to do. In this new realm, I want my folks constantly experimenting, constantly building new things, but they need access to secure and compliant data. They need to build things that isn't going to tarnish our reputation. The security and compliance of the things we build still matters in an extreme way. And so the challenge for digital security, and what organizations that get it have really figured out, is this is me taking a portion of what I do as a security organization and developing new interfaces for each of these layers that align to the foundational goal, right? Which, and I should say goals and kind of like multiple, right? I need variability, I need speed, I need adaptability, I need to be agile, I need to think about driving adoption, not forcing compliance and adherence. And I still need to accomplish my underlying goals of being secure and compliant. And this is what, when we had our first customer 7 years ago, big bank, we intrinsically knew that this was the case. And what was really interesting is that when we talked to them about this digital pillar 7 years ago, and they instantly realized, oh my gosh, like, because of this underlying equation, a lot of the things we do today, we're going to still have to accomplish them, but we're going to have to rethink them. How should we approach this? Most of the time, financial institutions or corporations who had already gone to the cloud were basically approaching the cross-functional teams who are trying to innovate and build things. And either they were trying to block them, which obviously isn't what we're going to focus on. If they were going to allow them to do it, there was a bit of washing of hands of the whole thing. And they would drop off this giant list of compliance and controls that, hey, fine, if you're going to go to the cloud, you have to meet all these things. Good luck. If you don't, you're going to get in big trouble. And we realized the first thing we need to do is build common control library directly for your organization that simplifies everything into a common library of potential cloud controls. So we would call this the cloud control library because everything's being built on cloud. What we knew needed to happen then is we're not just going to drop that off on, on the doorstep of these teams. We've actually got to build a consulting process that we call application control subset, but we're going to go to your workload, what you are thinking about building and where you're going to build it, not at a detailed design level, but just to say, hey, you're building a machine learning app that needs to be might have some PCI data in it, and you're building it on Azure. Fantastic. You don't have to tell us anything more. You don't have to tell us which Azure services you're going to use, etc. What we're going to focus on first is with these kind of parameters in mind. If you've got 1,000 controls here, we might think that there are 500 that are applicable to this kind of application based on what we know about Azure, PCI, etc. Then what we talked about is how most organizations also have multiple teams involved in the construction of cloud-based digital workloads. A lot of times they'll have a cloud foundations team who build and operationalize the kind of shared common components of cloud. They might have a platform team who operationalize common components that engineering teams are going to want to build on top of that enable them to do some kind of broad use case. So I might have, an API microservices platform based on like Kubernetes, let's say, right, that has everything kind of pieced together, whether it's the DevOps pipelines, the Kubernetes-based infrastructure, the monitoring, the alerting, all these pieces that I need to set up to basically effectively build applications on a platform. I might actually have a team whose job it is to build that stuff in a repeatable way that's consumable by actual product teams. And then obviously I have product teams who are actually developing stuff on top of this. Now, where organizations are at in terms of this maturity, we had to build a step that would account for this, but meet them where they're at, because if they didn't have a platform team, the idea that security could just walk away and say, like, well, we'll still just drop off, the 500 controls and not help you at all understand how you navigate this or what it's going to be like, or et cetera, wasn't an acceptable thing. So the next thing we came up with, and this, we definitely took this directly from the cloud providers, but applied it more broadly inside the enterprise, is the idea of a shared responsibility model, right? So if you go to AWS or Azure, they've always been upfront about, hey, here's what we're accountable for. Here's what you as the consumer of this service are accountable for. We'll ensure that the data center environments are secure and compliant, and we'll provide you evidence to the case. But if you open up firewall rules inside of your cloud environment that allow anybody in, that's on you, right? We're not going to guarantee that what you build is secure and compliant, right? So there's very, kind of strict and stringent shared responsibility model. Well, what digital security groups figured out is that same kind of mentality basically continued on to these teams, right? Where, hey, if I have a team who's in charge of the foundational cloud elements, and I look at these 500 controls that are in this application control set for, ML, PCI, and Azure, the Cloud Foundation group actually institutes and builds and configures, assuming that you build in one of their accounts, 100 of these, right? And we have a platform group for this digital team builds a platform that has, built-in change and configuration and asset management pieces that we would use for audit in their platform. And so they're taking, really another, let's say 200 of these controls. And if you're building on their platform, they're the ones that are accountable. And we've got 200 left that the product development group actually has to care about when they build a thing. Now, I'm exaggerating in terms of numbers here. It's usually not that high. Most product development teams that are at a semi-state of maturity on cloud with platform and foundations teams operating, the developer has much less than that. But I'll talk about kind of how you get there long term. So add the control library, whittle that down. We categorize our workloads with consulting engagement from the security organization. We push the practice of shared responsibility models as how we contractually navigate security and compliance together. And then what we do is we actually institute the controls. Now, this is where we help a lot of security organizations understand the demarcation point between what they're doing And now what they're going to ask their technology organizations to do to be in compliance. And in the past, this is a bit of a change, right? Because in the past, a lot of times, the security organization was building a perimeter around the data center. They were instituting their practices inside the PMO. They were ensuring that things are happening inside ITSM, and they were doing a lot of the engineering of the actual technology implementation of security-centric things to ensure this IT services pillar was secure. In digital, because there is so much variability, because cloud represents so many potential solutions, it's impossible to basically, unless you're going to hire, a workforce as large as your digital workforce, which doesn't make any sense, to be the ones doing all the control implementation. And this, like I said, is quite a pivot from the past. And that's because of the variability. Because if I have, let's say, even just 3 digital teams, one that's focused on data, one that's focused on mobile, and one that's focused on, new application development for web-based applications, et cetera. The number of, and then I have a foundation platform team, a combined team, let's say, that does both of these things. I might be a little smaller company. I could be looking at upwards of 50 different services, maybe more, from a single cloud provider that I have to figure out how to build in a secure and compliant way. And if security says, oh, my job is to implement these controls, then security basically either has to have such a capacity that they can, unilaterally service everybody, or they have to go back to the services mentality, which is, hey, you got to prioritize. I can only deal with one of you at a time, and you'll have to go in order. Well, that limits the benefit of cloud, because cloud is gives us unlimited scale, unlimited interfaces. There is no need to wait. It's multi-tenant by nature. And so if we go back to that mechanism, it really slows us down. And so digital security organizations realize this is what they're doing in phase 1 with the start of things. I can't be the one that instituting the controls. I don't have the expertise, the capacity, the manpower, etc. And so I'm going to put my line of demarc kind of in the middle of shared responsibility model. I will help my digital groups understand this part of the process and adopting this mechanism. And then when it actually comes to instituting the controls, I'm going to put that on them. And I'm going to focus on evidence collection. So the last piece of this process to ensure that what we're doing is secure compliant and meet these folks where they're at is say, okay, I figured out how to simplify the control pieces. I figured out how to just select the right pieces for the given workload, so I'm handling all the variability that exists in cloud. I'm instituting processes that account for how cloud is operationalized, how these product groups work, and that, like I said, takes into account all the digital pieces. I've understood who's actually going to be doing the engineering and how to arm them with the right information. Now there's one step left. I have to ask them, hey, if you're the ones that are doing this, you need to provide evidence to the fact that you have instituted these things. And I can't expect that evidence to be collected in a manual way. I need that to be scalable, right? Where if I've got 100 product teams that are providing evidence, I'm not going to be the wait in line so I can hear your evidence. And this is where the group then starts to do actual, what I'd say be like more engineering oriented things. Where they're spending a lot of their time from an engineering perspective in phase 1 is on evidence collection and building an API for their organization, their digital security API, that specifically allows these groups to provide the evidence in an automated way that they're doing the things that they do. So sometimes, that takes the form of, a centralized logging mechanism that I can send logs to that I'm doing things. Other times it means, actually, sending raw files that aren't like log, I mean, they're similar to logs, but that I need to articulate, this is the format of the JSON you're receiving, this is the information there, and then it needs to go to something like ServiceNow or some kind of ITSM-based audit platform that's still good at that, and security is really the one that's ensuring this. So from a teaming perspective in phase 1, we typically see as a security organization They start their own cross-functional team, and that cross-functional team hyper focuses on getting this entire workflow going and engaging with these groups. That cross-functional team, funny enough, looks a lot like any of these cross-functional teams that you'd see in here. It usually has security expertise, and then that's maybe a little bit different. We don't have to have like deep security expertise in all these cross-functional teams. That's fundamentally what this framework is doing, is solving what security steps these groups need to take in their day-to-day. But in the cross-functional team that would help institute the stuff and get it consumed, we have security expertise, we have cloud expertise, we have DevOps expertise. You might actually have some like specific architecture roles if that's kind of how your company works, and you're going to have product and agile expertise. And this is going to be the start of the foundational resources that you need for phase two. This is a good amount of work, right? Because you focused on instituting a new process for how we make security and compliance something that our digital organization can navigate. And you've had to focus on building a new interface based on APIs and cloud native design in its own right for the evidence collection. And if you've got this humming, your phase one outcome is that digital teams can build what they need to build. They have a predefined mechanism in the shared responsibility model to articulate between the different organizations and teams that are involved in building this stuff, who's accountable, who's got what, right? Without a bunch of argument and politics. It's very clear cut. Hey, this is how we establish a shared responsibility model. They know what's to be expected of them without being given, a giant stack of controls. And ultimately, security is giving them an interface to kind of get to the end state of this and demonstrate they're doing what they said they would do in a way through APIs that they're used to, that aligns with what they're doing, right? For most organizations, this kind of approach that our leaders are driving them to, you should expect it to take, and probably a year to truly get this humming. Not because this is that complicated, right? Like, setting up this process and articulating to most folks, like I said, I can do it in, 2 hours in a workshop, and they understand what we're trying to accomplish. The challenge is actually navigating these projects. These projects the digital group is building take time, and they're building this as they go. Maybe the one thing I didn't cover off on is what a lot of times happens is because we're asking the groups to take care of the controls, they're aligning that with their agile work backlogs. So all of a sudden you start to see, hey, I've got this backlog item that says, as a developer, I'm building, this new feature set we haven't built before. And inside of the acceptance criteria of that backlog item are the specific controls that I'm expected to figure out how to engineer and provide evidence to before I count this specific backlog item is done. So what that does is it sets the speed of getting to the level of maturity on this stuff to match the speed of what our digital transformation is doing. But that was the goal in the first place, right? Don't be the one that slows us down, be the one that enables us to operate the speed we need to go at. So we see most of the time, companies are spending about the first year really getting this process to be at a well-executed pace. But the security organization, if they understand this going into it, within a few months is already well ahead of, if you will, the other teams as they figure out digital and get things built. They're never the ones that are impeding it, which is usually our number one goal. Is security want to be seen as blockers, but we also don't want to be seen as not ensuring security and compliance. All right, so if that's phase one, right, what does phase two look like? Well, phase two, what we look at is, hey, if we had functional teams, looks like product teams, and like I said, that can be data, can be app, etc. I usually have a platform team, and again, these don't have to be teams. They could just be a team performing these capabilities. And I have a cloud foundation group, and they've got their shared responsibility model, and they've got ACSs, what they should be building. Then this cross-functional team now has a bunch of new opportunity. So our take on digital from what should be common across these things is the product mentality. And we know a lot of this now, like project versus product is a common terminology and things like that. This is holding true for security as well. So I've got this cross-functional team sitting here, right? And they've worked hard on getting this workflow adopted. Teams are using it, and the question now is, okay, now what? What should I do next? Well, ultimately, what we want to be doing, looking at this shared responsibility model. And if we look at the shared responsibility model as kind of like what we would call like a toil meter for product teams. So if what's in blue represents what the product teams have to do, and what's in green represents what all the other teams are doing. With toil, right, we would see, not to say that it's not product's job to care about this stuff, but the more we ask those resources to, focus on things that aren't directly involved in the development of features that the business understands as impactful to what they're trying to accomplish, we would say they have more and more toil. And that's seen over time as negative, because the less toil they have, the more things they can build, basically, time they have. But we can't sacrifice time to market because there's a high toil rate, right? So I might have, as I get started on my digital journey, digital teams, and in the enterprise, we see this all the time, who have chosen basically to configure cloud and platform and all these things on their own and said, fine, I will do everything so that I can get moving, so that I don't have to wait for the broader organization to catch up. Well, obviously, if you take a framework like this and you're starting to use the platform and cloud foundations mechanisms and ACSs, the organization is basically catching up, or has already caught up, if you will. And now what we can do is actually go on offense instead of be on defense. And being on offense means if we can get it to look like this, where there is just a tiny amount of the product team to worry about, and the rest of it, that the rest of the organization worries about, the better. And if we take it further and say that as a security organization, we have the opportunity for certain pieces to be able to take it on ourselves. So even on these platform teams, they themselves are usually faced with a lot of toil. If everyone has product mentality in their mind, then their job is to get whatever they're doing consumed and having the desired impact that they're supposed to have. And so they tend to take on more and more and more, lower the toil for their customer, make it easy. I wrote an article on our blog a few years ago where Elon Musk talked about how, like, his main design principle is that any user input, the less user input, the better. And that's that representation of toil. And in this sense, the less amount of security engineering, the less amount of control engineering, the less amount of platform engineering I'm asking of my product teams, that I'm asking of my platform team, the better. And so everyone's trying to reduce toil. And what we believe is phase two for many security organizations is looking for the same opportunity to reduce the amount of toil that's put on all of the teams involved in digital as it relates to, security and compliance. And the beauty is that we can engage them in the same way, meet them where they're at. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at what these groups are actually producing, they're producing a whole bunch of very technical interfaces that we can start to engage with. So where phase one was a lot of times mostly focused on a process and a little bit of API at the end, phase two is very much focused on heavy technology engineering. So we're getting into being able to say we're a digital security engineering organization, but we're identifying key areas that if we build something and get our digital organizations to consume it, that's going to have benefit for them, because they're going to see their toil related to these controls go down. So that could look like, and I'll give some tangible examples. We know that they have pipelines. We know that most of the configuration and deployment and release management kind of mechanisms in our new world through DevOps is done through pipelines. And that a lot of the times the automation that they're building to ensure security and compliance for the controls that we applicated are actually happening inside the steps inside the pipeline. Well, if we, as the cross-functional engineering team, can build a common set of pipeline actions that don't need to be re-engineered every time, that modules that team can just import and know that, hey, if I run this job, this has solved a lot of the security and compliance automation that I would have to re-engineer on my own. Or better yet, they might say, hey, this step in the pipeline that you guys have been doing to do that, we've actually instituted a new monitoring tool. Like there's like, just as an example, let's say there's a specific step in the pipeline that does secure packaging of containers, right? To ensure that the containers we're using are basically secure and compliant. And we know each individual team and the platform team have been working on how to do that consistently, right? But they've got a number of solutions that are pipeline based, and they can't individually justify the cost for a more like I don't want to say like elegant, but a more comprehensive suite of tools that would accomplish this in a less intrusive way. While security can get that justification and say, listen, I can get the majority of the product development teams and the platform teams to consume this new technology. I look across their pipelines and I see tens of thousands of hours of engineering work to maintain this single step that ensures security and compliance of the containers 6 or 7 different ways. Now the cross-functional team can come in from the security organization and say, hey, we've got this new tool. It integrates with what you're doing by replacing these customized steps with just a common API interface that if you use this template job, if you import that into your pipeline, you now get to make use of this and you don't have to maintain that step anymore. You can just interact with the API. Maybe it pulls down our already vetted and secure and compliant container. Maybe it automatically scans things and does things that we purchase so we don't have to custom build, and you don't have to worry about maintaining this anymore. We might have just lowered a bunch of toil. That doesn't just look like pipelines. It could also be process oriented. Not to say like security has more authority than one group or the other, but there is an aspect that you don't want to be on security's radar, right? That's a powerful thing. So a lot of these platform teams, though, when they start, because they've taken so much of the work on around the shared responsibility model, the ACSs, these kind of control implementation processes, they might have to lower the toil on the product development group, have taken on identification of where product has missed on some of their controls. So they might be doing some of the audit functionality to help product understand where they have holes before they get to a critical stage in their product development lifecycle, where they see as like being impeded by control. So they're lowering that toil down the road. But there's maybe only so much bite that a platform team can have. And so security might say, hey, we're seeing that platform team is spending a lot of their time consistently following up with the product teams on security and compliance goals, and product doesn't seem to be taking it very seriously, or they're having a communication problem. We're going to build a new process that interacts with the platform team's process that allows them to escalate to us, and we will take on this vulnerability management at a more enterprise scale and have more weight to go after those product teams. Now, this might be seen as like, maybe slowing us down. But what we see is that security's ability to actually articulate the broad impact of risk is just better than what a platform team is doing as best they can do. So you might even have processes that you interact with. And again, you're looking at the toil of the platform team and helping lower that. You might also identify in the cloud space automations. So when you look at how these controls are implemented, you might see that there is like a lot of solutions for, solving this control item. If we built a consistent automation that is, let's say like it's like a compliance automation that's constantly checking, and this is a big undertaking where other teams didn't have time to justify the time it took to do this, kind of like with the purchasing of a tool, the building of a tool is also valid. Maybe I built some kind of complex Azure policy that other organizations don't have the time to do because they're focused on other things. So what this ultimately leads to is cross-functional engineering teams in the security organization who are focused on, number one, lowering toil where they can. They're trying to now, which I know I said it wasn't as important to go, but they're identifying areas where they can increase efficiency. And they're doing this through a focus on increasing adoption. So not forcing adoption, but building things that other teams they want to adopt because of the raw value of what it's providing. And by doing it this way, you're actually increasing velocity and increasing efficiency at the same time, which is, if you did the other way where you're trying to fit this world into this world, you actually see the exact opposite. You see, negative impact on velocity. And this is ultimately where we get to the place of having a digital security organization was really, if you want to put like the plus, they're adding a ton of value into this equation because of their focus area. And they really become a strong engineering capacity within the organization. And then if there was such a thing as phase 3, and the reason I don't really consider it phase 3 in the digital realm, because it doesn't necessarily affect digital as much, but this engineering horsepower that is trained on cloud, that's trained on automations, that's trained on pipelines, that's trained on all these things, what they can do is they can actually circle back to not only this IT services organization, but the security organization at large, who's trying to accomplish, security and compliance, not just in technology, but outside of technology, and really bring their expertise and horsepower back to these groups. And now you've got this like force multiplier, and this is where you might see a few like more modern like web scale companies, like you hear about like the security organizations at Google or at Netflix. Again, these are kind of like, okay, yes, that's not who financial institutions are. I get it, but you have the raw engineering capacity now where you can start to build things that are outside of digital, that broadly impact your whole organization's security, new risk and compliance mechanisms, new things that are really making security almost a new channel for value to a certain extent. It's a little bit of a stretch to say they're directly related to profit, but if you can, for example, develop a new way to do non-technology related audit and compliance that reduces the toil on business units who need to be audited, you might have just allowed them to go generate a whole bunch of more business because they're not focused on that, right? And the reason you can do that is because you're using cloud native solutions that you've learned as a digital security organization, and through solving the toil issue for our digital groups, and creating now, like I said, this force multiplier. All right, so that I don't have a phase 4, so we haven't gotten there in any of the organizations I'm working with. Most of the most advanced groups are just starting to get right here. A lot of groups are kind of staring at this transition going from phase 1 to phase 2, and most of our engineering work nowadays is focused in this phase 2, and sometimes still we're getting engaged a little bit on the phase 1. But this is really what we think that like security leadership, who's having to navigate the digital kind of realm and institute digital security. If they have this blueprint for by phase of how they want to actually institute this, it's going to make them really effective at helping their organization, avoid the pitfalls, avoid a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in organizations who go down this without a blueprint like this. Do you have any follow-ups? And like I said, we're always happy to help. So.